Emma Collins had learned to live quietly. At 33, she was the kind of woman who carried a gentle strength in her soft smiles and thoughtful eyes. She ran a small but beloved bookstore nestled in the heart of Seattle, a place where the smell of old paper mixed with fresh coffee and the quiet hum of conversations about stories and dreams. Emma's life was comfortable in its own way, filled with routines she found peaceful. But underneath it all, there was a loneliness she never quite admitted to anyone. She had settled into the rhythm of her days with a quiet hope that maybe, one day, something would change. But she never expected that change to come in the form of Ryan Carter. Ryan was a name from her past she had tried hard to forget. They had been close in college, best friends who shared secrets. Late night talks and the kind of laughter that felt like it could light up the darkest room. But life had pulled them apart. He had left Seattle, moved on with his career, and eventually married. When she heard he was back in town, part of her heart stirred with old memories she thought were buried deep. Their first meeting after all these years was unexpected. It happened at a casual gathering, a mutual friend's housewarming party. Emma walked into the warm room filled with familiar faces, but it was Ryan's presence that stopped her. He was taller now, his hair a bit more salt than pepper. But his eyes, the same tired green eyes that had once looked at her with an easy kindness, were what caught her breath. When he saw her, his smile was a mix of surprise and something softer, almost hesitant. "Emma," he said, as if saying her name aloud brought the past rushing back. She felt a flutter she hadn't expected, a rush of warmth that made her cheeks flush. "Ryan Carter," she replied, laughter lightly touching her voice. "Look at you." Their hug was longer than necessary, filled with the weight of years spent apart. It was a moment heavy with unspoken words and regrets, but also with a quiet comfort, as if they had slipped back into a rhythm only they understood. After that night, they found themselves thinking about each other more often than they admitted. There were text messages exchanged late at night, casual at first, just checking in, but slowly turning into conversations about everything and nothing. Emma found herself smiling at her phone, her heart beating faster at the sound of his name. Ryan, despite the ring on his finger and the life he had built, was no stranger to feeling trapped. His marriage had settled into a routine that left him empty, a polite companionship that lacked the spark he once dreamed of. Talking to Emma felt like breathing again, like remembering who he used to be before responsibility and compromise dulled his edges. They began to meet by chance in places they both loved: quiet coffee shops, book readings, and the parks where they once wandered as young adults dreaming of the future. Each meeting was a thread, weaving them closer together, a connection that grew more electric with every glance and every shared smile. Emma caught herself stealing looks at Ryan when she thought he wasn't watching, noticing the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, or how his voice softened when he talked about his son. There was a rawness to their moments in honesty that neither had found elsewhere. But there was also a shadow hanging over them, a silent warning that what they were doing was dangerous. They both knew he was married. They both knew the line they were approaching could shatter more than just their fragile peace. And yet they didn't pull away. One evening, after a late autumn rain had soaked the city streets, Ryan sent Emma a text that said, "Can we talk?" Just us. Emma's heart raced as she agreed. They met at a quiet spot by Green Lake, the water calm and reflecting the soft gray sky. Ryan spoke in low tones about the cracks in his marriage, the loneliness behind the closed doors, the distance that no one dared to bridge. Emma listened, her own pain rising in sympathy. She spoke of her solitude, the ache of feeling unseen, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for happiness. Their conversation stretched long into the evening, the space between them charged with a new kind of intimacy. It was time to leave. Their hands brushed briefly, tenderly lingering longer than either expected. Neither said the words, but the silence spoke volumes. They were no longer just old friends catching up. Something deeper, more urgent, was taking root in the quiet spaces between their glances and touches. That night, Emma lay awake, her mind swirling with the taste of his voice and the warmth of his touch. She knew they were crossing a line, but for the first time in years, she didn't want to turn back. Asterisk, the thing about emotional affairs is that they rarely begin with intent, just a moment. A look, a small decision to let someone in a little closer than they should be. How it was for Emma and Ryan after that rainy evening by Green Lake. Things between them changed not all at once, but in a slow, quiet way that felt both beautiful and dangerous. Their meetings started to feel less like coincidence and more like routine. They told themselves they were just catching up, just old friends. But deep down, they both knew. Emma found herself waiting for his texts, noticing how her mood would shift when his name lit up her phone. Sometimes it was something simple, thinking about that book you recommended, and other times it was more personal. Can't sleep. Everything feels heavy tonight. That's how their late-night conversations began. In the silence of their own separate bedrooms, they would talk for hours, their voices low, intimate, like confessions whispered in the dark. Ryan spoke about the parts of his life he didn't show anyone else, how being a husband had turned into a role he performed rather than a feeling he lived. He wasn't bitter or cruel when he spoke about his wife, Alyssa. He was just tired of pretending, tired of sleeping next to someone who hadn't touched him in months, tired of feeling invisible in his own home. Emma listened, torn between guilt and compassion. She wasn't the kind of woman who got involved with married men. That wasn't her story. But with Ryan, it never felt like she was stealing anything. It felt like she was waking up something that had been dying in both of them for years. And she couldn't lie to herself anymore. He made her feel alive again. There was a depth in their conversations that she hadn't felt in years. He noticed things about her no one else did, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, how she always hummed softly when she read. He remembered the smallest details from their college years, memories that made her laugh and ache at the same time. They began meeting for coffee once a week, then twice, then dinners at places far from his neighborhood, always somewhere quiet, always with the table in the back. They never touched, not really. Just a brush of his hand as he passed her the wine or the warmth of his shoulder when they sat too close. But it was enough to make her heart pound. They were playing with fire, and every part of her knew it. Yet every time she saw him walk toward her with that half smile that belonged only to her, she let herself fall a little more. Ryan, too, was caught in the in-between. He didn't want to lie, but he didn't know how to leave. He told himself that he was only talking to Emma, that they hadn't done anything wrong. But his silence at home, the way he avoided eye contact with Alyssa, told a different story. He began to dread going back to the house. Emma had become his escape, his breath of fresh air after years of emotional suffocation. One evening, they sat on a park bench as the sun set behind the city skyline. The light painted everything gold, and for a moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. Emma turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever wonder how it might have been? Things had gone differently between us?" Ryan looked at her, the sadness in his eyes deeper than any answer. "Every day," he said. The space between them crackled. He reached for her hand, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, and for a long time they sat in silence, hearts racing with what they weren't saying. When he dropped her off that night, he didn't kiss her. But his hand lingered on her cheek, his eyes searching hers as if he was asking permission for something he didn't have the courage to do yet. She watched him drive away, her heart aching with longing guilt. And the kind of desire that doesn't just burn, it consumes. At home, she'll lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she got here. She wasn't in love with a fantasy. She was falling for a man who belonged to someone else. And yet, in the most honest corners of her heart, she knew she hadn't felt this alive, this scene, in years. It wasn't just about chemistry. It was something deeper, something terrifyingly real. They hadn't crossed the final line yet, but they were close. One more look, one more night, one more excuse. And the truth would no longer be something they could hide behind glances or unspoken feelings. The love that was growing between them wasn't just emotional anymore. It was physical. It was dangerous. And it was inevitable. By the time fall settled over Seattle with its golden leaves and chilly winds, Emma and Ryan had stopped pretending they were just friends. They still hadn't crossed the final line, but the space between them was charged. Every word, every look, every lingering pause felt like a touch. Their weekly coffee dates had turned into late-night dinners. Their texts now held things they didn't dare say out loud. And while neither of them dared to label what they had, they both knew it was more than just comfort. It was connection, intimacy, a hunger that grew with every stolen moment. Emma found herself rearranging her schedule just to see him. She wore her hair differently on the days she knew he'd be around. She paid more attention to the way she dressed, the perfume she wore, the way her voice sounded when she said his name. And Ryan, he began to feel things he hadn't felt in years. With Emma, he could breathe. He could laugh again. He could talk about things that mattered. She listened to him not out of obligation, but because she truly saw him. Not as a husband, or a father, or a man who had made mistakes, but as the version of himself he had almost forgotten existed. At home, things with Alyssa grew colder. She had her own walls, her own pain, and somewhere along the way, they had become two people sharing a house, not a marriage. Ryan didn't want to hurt her. He still respected her. But he couldn't deny that the man he became when he was with Emma felt more real than anything he had felt in years. One night, after a long, exhausting day, he showed up at Emma's apartment without warning. Rain was falling hard, drenching the city in a moody gray. And when she opened the door, she found him standing there soaked, out of breath, and looking like he had run from a storm much bigger than the one outside. "I needed to see you," he said, voice low and rough. Emma stepped back wordlessly and let him in. Didn't speak for a while. She handed him a towel. He dried off quietly. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was full of everything they hadn't yet said. Emma stood in front of him, arms crossed, trying to steady her heart. She knew this was dangerous. She knew what could happen if they stopped holding back, but still he was here. And something about the way he looked at her made it impossible to pretend anymore. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, though her voice trembled with more hope than warning. "I know," he said, "but I couldn't stay away." He walked closer, slowly, carefully, as if afraid he might break her or himself. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, everything they'd buried came rising to the surface. But he didn't kiss her. He didn't touch her. Instead, he sat beside her on the couch, and for hours, they just talked. About everything. About nothing. They shared fears, regrets, small, beautiful memories from their past. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, something shifted. Not in words. Not in a dramatic confession. But in the way he looked at her like she was the only person who had ever truly understood him. And in the way she smiled, back soft, vulnerable, open. When he finally left that morning, Emma stood at the door long after he was gone, her fingers still warm from where he had gently squeezed her hand before leaving. They hadn't slept together. Not yet. But the intimacy between them had grown so deep, so real, it scared her. Because once they crossed that line, there would be no going back. She knew that. And still, part of her ached for it, longed for. It needed it like air. The next few days were a blur. Found herself thinking about him constantly. His scent, his voice. It's the way he had looked at her like she was his beginning and not his mistake. But she also thought about Alyssa, about the child, about the life that wasn't hers to tear apart. The guilt tangled with the desire pulling her in both directions. But what terrified her most wasn't the risk, it was how right it all felt. Like he was always meant to come back into her life. Like the timing was finally tragically perfect. Ryan, too, couldn't shake the feeling that he was living two lives. The man who sat at dinner with his wife out of habitand. The man who texted Emma afterward just to hear her voice. His days felt heavier, his nights longer, and every time he closed his eyes, he imagined her standing in the doorway, smiling with her whole heart, offering him a kind of love that didn't ask him to shrink or disappear. They were dancing on the edge of something real, something dangerous. And deep down, they both knew it was only a matter of time before they would stop pretending and finally give in to what they already felt in every part of their soul. Asterisk, it happened on a quiet Thursday night. The kind of night that didn't seem like it would change anything, but did. Emma had been closing her bookstore when Ryan showed up outside, standing in the soft glow of the street lamp, his hands in his jacket pockets, eyes searching. She opened the door, heart racing, already knowing that tonight would be different. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Something between them had shifted. The air was heavier, charged with all the longing and restraint they had bottled up for too long. Emma poured them each a glass of wine, her fingers trembling just enough to make her pause. Ryan sat at the edge of the couch, looking tired, like a man who had been fighting himself for far too long. "I'm losing pieces of myself," he said softly, not looking at her. "And you're the only thing that still feels real." The words hit her in the chest like a heartbeat that had been waiting to be heard. She didn't answer right away. She just walked over, slow and unsure, and sat beside him. The silence wrapped around them, warm and full of tension. He looked at her, and in that moment, everything they had been avoiding collapsed between them. There was no dramatic move, no sudden kiss, just a slow, aching closeness as his fingers brushed her cheek and she leaned into his touch like she had always belonged there. When their lips finally met, it was gentle at first, almost hesitant, like they were still asking each other for permission. But that kiss, God, it deepened quickly. It was months of unsaid things, years of hidden emotions. It was fire and pain, and sweetness all at once. Clothes came off in hurried whispers, their hands moving like they were memorizing skin and bone. It wasn't perfect or pretty, it was raw, desperate, real. Two people who had held back for too long finally letting go. They made love like it meant something, because it did. Every touch was filled with unspoken promises, every gasp a release of guilt and hunger tangled together. And afterward, as they lay tangled in sheets on her small bed, their breathing heavy and their bodies still buzzing, Ryan pulled her close like he was afraid she'd disappear. "What do we do now?" Emma whispered into the dark. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he kissed her forehead and held her tighter. And in that silence, she understood he didn't know. Neither of them did. The next morning was tender but heavy. He kissed her goodbye, like it hurt, and she stood at the door long after he left, her fingers grazing her lips, still warm from him. She knew this wasn't just a one-time moment. It was a shift, a turning point. But she also knew it had consequences real. Ones, and as much as her heart ached to keep him, a voice deep inside reminded her someone else was still waiting for him to come home. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. Their affair became a secret rhythm: texts in the early mornings, phone calls late at night, afternoons stolen in hotel rooms or behind bookstore shelves. But it wasn't just sex. It was deeper than that. They shared dreams, wounds, Emma began, to imagine a life with him, a real one. Mornings with coffee, shared routines, maybe even one day meeting his son. Ryan talked about leaving, about starting over, about how he couldn't live in between anymore. But something always stopped. Him, guilt, fear, the weight of a family that still existed, even if the love was fading. Emma tried to be patient. She didn't pressure him. Well, she knew this was complicated. But each time he left her bed and went back to that other life, a little piece of her heart cracked. She didn't want to be a secret. She didn't want to be the other woman, even if it never felt that way with him. She wanted all of him, more none at all. One night, lying next to him, she asked, "If this isn't real for you, tell me now. I need to know." Ryan looked at her, eyes red-rimmed and tired. "It's real," he said, voice breaking. "But real doesn't make it simple." She nodded, tears quietly falling, because she understood. But understanding didn't make it hurt any less. That night, she didn't sleep. She just watched him, wondering how love could feel so right and so wrong all at once. She had waited her whole life for a love that set her on fire, and now that she had it, it came with ashes. It all started to unravel the night Alyssa found Emma's name on Ryan's phone, not in a message, but in a saved voicemail. She hadn't meant to snoop. She was simply trying to move some photos onto his laptop for their son's school project. But curiosity is a quiet storm it sneaks in, and when it hits, it doesn't leave anything untouched. The message was short. Emma's voice was soft, almost whispering, "I miss you. I know you're probably with him right now, but I needed to hear your voice." Alyssa didn't cry, not at first. She just sat there, numb, as the weight of what she already suspected settled over her like a cold wave. She didn't confront him that night. Instead, she watched him from across the dinner table, trying to see the man she had married. "Oh, buddy!" Looked like a stranger, distant, distracted, guilty. She saw it all now, the late night walks, the longer work hours, the way he barely looked her in the eye anymore. For a moment, she hated him. Then she hated herself for not noticing sooner. Or maybe for noticing and doing nothing. But the thing that hurt the most wasn't the betrayal, it was that someone else had taken her place in his heart. Meanwhile, Emma had no idea the secret was no longer a secret. She was still wrapped in the illusion that what they were building could eventually have a future. She started looking at houses in quieter neighborhoods, imagining what it would feel like to wake up beside him every morning without hiding. She had even rehearsed what she might say to his son. How to introduce herself not as the woman who ruined a family, but as someone who genuinely cared. Ryan, caught in the middle of two worlds, was slowly crumbling under the weight of his choices. He wanted to be the man Emma believed he could be, but part of him still clung to the wreckage of his old life, the familiarity, the guilt, the responsibility. Every day he told himself he would end it. That he would finally tell Alyssa the truth. But every night he returned home and kissed his sleeping son on the forehead, and the courage vanished. Then one evening everything cracked open. Alyssa asked him simply, "Is there someone else?" Ryan froze. It was the kind of question that didn't need an answer. She already knew. But still, he nodded. Quietly, and in that moment something broke in both of them. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at him with a sadness that was heavier than anger. "I hope she's worth it," she whispered. The days that followed were chaos. Ryan moved out and into a friend's apartment. Alyssa filed for separation, and the air between them turned cold and mechanical about custody, about logistics, about everything except the broken hearts that lay between them. When he told Emma what had happened, she didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just held his hand and asked, "Are you okay?" Because she knew this wasn't a victory. It was a loss for everyone. But with the truth out, they no longer had to hide. They began to live in the open dinners at restaurants, walking hand in hand through Pike Place Market, weekends curled up in bed without fear. But even then, something was different. The fire was still there, the love still real. But now the shadows had faces. Ryan missed his son deeply. Every night he wasn't with him felt like a piece of him was missing. And Emma struggled with a quiet guilt she couldn't shake. People whispered. Friends disappeared. Her parents asked hard questions. And sometimes when Ryan fell silent in the middle of their laughter, she wondered if he was thinking of Alyssa, of what he'd left behind. Love had always felt like the answer, but now it felt more like a complicated question. They tried to make it work. They built routines, shared moments, made love with the same desperation, but now with a tenderness that came from surviving the fallout. Still, cracks began to form. Not in how they felt, but in the weight of what it had cost them to get here. One night, Emma asked, "Do you ever regret it?" Ryan looked at her for a long time. "Not you," he said. "Never you. But I regret that someone had to get hurt for me to find you." And that was the truth neither of them could ignore. Love had saved them, but it had also broken someone else. And no matter how deep their feelings ran, that fact never left them room. It lived between them, quiet but constant. A reminder that even the most beautiful love stories can be built on broken pieces. And sometimes, loving someone doesn't erase the damage, just teaches you how to live with it. Months passed. The seasons shifted again, from the cold winds of winter to the quiet promises of spring. Emma and Ryan had settled into something. Close to normal, a shared apartment near the water. A cozy Sunday routine of coffee and quiet mornings, and a bedroom filled with warm touches and soft laughter. But even as life moved forward, the past still had a way of showing up in the small spaces. Ryan saw his son on weekends, sometimes more. The child was adjusting slowly, asking harder questions each time, his voice carrying the innocent weight of confusion. And every time Ryan brought him back to Alyssa's house, there was that silent exchange at the door, Alyssa standing tall. Calm, polite, but with eyes that never softened. Emma tried to stay out of it, tried to respect the boundaries, but she often felt like a shadow in her own life. She loved Ryan deeply, but she couldn't ignore the cost that came with him. Sometimes she'd wake up next to him, watching him sleep, and wonder if she would ever stop feeling like the woman who broke something. Still, she held on. Because what they had was real, raw, honest, in ways that scared her. They talked about everything now, the guilt, the pain, the fear of repeating old patterns. And when Ryan told her he wanted to marry her someday, it wasn't in a grand gesture, it was while folding laundry on a rainy Wednesday. "I want to grow old with you," he said, simple and sure. "Not because it's easy, but because I don't want anyone else beside me." Emma smiled, tears stinging her eyes, and whispered, "Then don't break me, Ryan. I've given you everything, but even love built on truth can be shaken." One evening, Ryan forgot his phone at home. Emma, cooking dinner, saw it light up on the counter. A message popped up, a name she didn't recognize. At first she ignored it, but then another came, and another. Her heart began to pound. Curiosity warred with trust, and after a few minutes, she gave in and unlocked it. The messages were from a woman, flirty, familiar, a bit too warm. Nothing explicit, but enough to set her heart on fire. "Miss your smile," one read. "Still thinking about that night." Emma stood frozen, nausea rising in her throat. When Ryan walked in an hour later, whistling casually, he knew the moment he saw her face. "Who is she?" Emma asked, her voice calm but shaking. Ryan's face dropped. "It's not what you think," but it was. Maybe not physical, but emotional. A conversation that shouldn't have been happening. It's a secret, again. A break in the trust they had fought so hard to build. Emma didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, the weight of disappointment settling into her chest. Like a stone. "I forgave you once," she said, voice low. "I don't know if I can do it again." That night, Ryan slept on the couch. The silence between them was colder than any argument, for the first time since they had found each other again. Emma felt like she was losing him, and, worse, she was losing herself in trying to keep him. Days passed with few words. Ryan apologized, explained, said it meant nothing. That it was an old coworker, someone he hadn't seen in years. But Emma didn't need explanations. She needed to feel safe, seen, chosen, and right now she didn't. Eventually they talked, really talked. In their small kitchen, surrounded by the smell. Of burnt toast and leftover coffee, they laid it all out, every fear, every mistake, every fragile part of their story. And for the first time, Ryan didn't make promises. He just said, "I'm human. I mess up. But I will never stop choosing you, Emma." She looked at him, eyes tired but still soft. "Then show me," she said, "every day. Not with flowers or words, but with honesty, with staying when it's hard, with not reaching for anyone else when you feel empty." They didn't end. They didn't fall apart. But they began again slowly, deliberately, with scars between them and love still, worth fighting for. Emma forgave him, not because she was weak, but because she believed in the man who stood in front of her, flawed but trying. And Ryan, for the first time, truly saw the depth of what he could lose. So he held her differently after that, spoke more gently, loved more fully. And while their story had been born in stolen glances and forbidden moments, it became something else entirely, something messier, deeper, more real. Because the truth is, love doesn't always come wrapped in perfection. Sometimes it's born from mistakes, shaped by pain, and held together by the quiet decision to stay. And for Emma and Ryan, that decision, the one to keep choosing each other, even after all the lies, was what made their love story unforgettable.